Next year is an election year. It's incumbent upon all of us to elect the right people into power, not for popularity, not for personal gains, but for the betterment of Sri Lanka as a whole. Thank you very much. God bless. Good night.
TV1, TV for life. The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the show. Our topic of discussion tonight is recognizing and addressing structural violence in Sri Lanka. My guest tonight is Professor Shamala Kumara from the University of Peradeniya. Good evening and welcome, Shamala.
Good evening.
I'm delighted to have you here with us in the studio.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Shamala, when we speak about structural violence, we're talking about a scenario where a social structure perpetuates inequity, thus causing preventable suffering. You work in a university setting. You've advocated for anti-ragging. Speak to us about how violence looks like in a university setting.
Okay, thanks for that question. I think when we think of educational settings in general, we think of it as a place where kind of almost the antithesis of violence, right? Where we have students and we want to give them the freedom to explore and kind of sort of part of the democratic process. So I think it's kind of an interesting environment in which to discuss violence. But we also know violence is we do experience a lot of this kind of violence, and there's a lot of discussion about violence in the universities and things like that. So for example, if you take the ragging is something that has been in the news a lot, and I think it's something that we all need to be concerned about. In addition to that, though, I think there are other forms of violence that we need to consider. So right now, if you think of our students and the experiences that we are having with them, we realize that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of what seems to be trauma in their lives. Some of it they bring from their homes.
Of course.
Sometimes it's livelihood issues. We have right now it has become quite we do see suicide attempts, suicides even. So that comes from some, and that is a manifestation of something that we really need to discuss. And to me, that is also a form of violence, like you mentioned, because today's society, we see a lot of pain in students and also the community, but there are lesser and lesser spaces to discuss these and for them to express themselves. So.
Right. So structural violence is often invisible, and it occurs when people feel disadvantaged by political, legal, social, cultural norms or traditions which have been in place, which have been normalized. And as you said, increasingly people feel isolated and unable to speak out about their truths, about their hurts. What's this like in the university setting? Because I know that there are structures in place. There are counseling mechanisms, mental health initiatives that are constantly taken by the state, other parties. So does this not help, or is the trauma so deep rooted that these don't help?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, we do now, for example, our faculty has various they initiated counseling programs, and we have all kinds of mechanisms to make sure that if there is a problem, there's somebody to look out for them. It's there. But I feel a lot of that is happening at a very micro level.
Right.
So we already are under-resourced, and we are going in there and we are using what little resources we have to try and address this issue. This is the same thing with ragging as well, right? But I think there needs to be a bigger national conversation about what our students are going through. Take, for example, at the time when we were going through the COVID pandemic, we went to online education, right? And online education was okay for some students. This was also true for schools. It was okay for some students, but in our village school, that system just did not work because people didn't have access to online systems. They didn't have technology. They had other issues. They were hungry. Their parents were not working, things like that. So in such a situation, the government's response was online education. And to me, there's a violence in that because we are not recognizing the kinds of problems that our students have. And we were the people with the problems were those who were the most sort of vulnerable also, right? It wasn't equally experienced by everyone. There was a segment of students who could, for example, if you take school education, who are able to get private tutoring, things like that, and they kind of managed during that time. But for others, they were completely left out of the system. So if we're talking about violence, I think we have to recognize structurally, institutionally, at every level, these kinds of ways in which people are silenced and not allowed to speak their truths, as you mentioned, right? The spaces to express themselves are also diminishing with time through various legislation, for example. So now the ATA, the Anti-Terrorism Act, again opens up spaces to prevent people from shutting people down, right? From not letting them speak. Similarly, the labor reforms that are coming up, they are going to make it much harder for collective action, which is a way that people with less power can get together and speak their truths. Or when it comes to students, there is a concerted effort to sort of depoliticize students, which is another way that students get of expressing their concerns and their concerns about the country, their future, all that is being shut down. So to me, all that is should be discussed when we are talking about violence, not just the physical violence, which is also important to discuss, but within the context of this broader way of looking at violence.
Do you feel like Sri Lankan society is reactive towards violence? It trivializes violence, only sees violence as a physical manifestation. For example, someone gets beaten up or killed. That is what is recognized as violence by society at large.
Yeah.
But there is so much more to the concept of violence, right? Speak to us about how you feel society needs to sort of rethink its definition of violence itself.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing before that. When you were saying we react to violence, right? I feel we do react to violence, but only under certain circumstances.
Okay.
So, for instance, we've been doing some research on bullying in the workplace, right? And when you ask people to, like, we have a series of acts of bullying. So it's certain types of acts that happen regularly. Those are considered bullying. So if you ask them, are you experiencing these acts? It's many of them are saying, yeah, we experience them. Many of them experience them within the context of their work role.
Okay.
So someone pushing them unreasonably, shouting at them, harassing them maybe to get their work done. Now in that context, not only do the organizations not recognize that as violence, but the people who are subjected to that are also not recognizing it as violence, because it's so consistent with what we expect in that context,
Right.
so that we have normalized it, as you maybe what you were saying. So I don't even, sometimes even violence that is overt, we don't recognize it. And it's the same with take complaints in a workplace where someone says, I'm being sexually harassed, or I've been harassed in some way. Oftentimes even that complaint has to be recognized as a act of violence by someone above you to actually be acknowledged as violence.
Right.
And often that doesn't happen.
So there is a trivialization.
Yeah. So even if you take the ragging process, there's sort of public outcry when somebody is very badly affected by ragging, but we don't have that same kind of reaction when somebody is asked to do small things. But actually that is as oppressive, and for some people it could be particularly oppressive.
And you're completely taking dignity out of the equation, right? Human dignity, which is one of the cornerstones of
and similarly, if the violence is occurring inside a house, or if the violence is one which fits into our idea of what gender roles are, then we may not recognize it, as you mentioned.
So the ecological model of violence at an individual level, relationship level, community level, societal level. So we'll be continuing the conversation on recognizing and addressing structural violence after this short commercial break. Stay with us.
The People's Platform.
ඔයාත් ඉතින් ලැජ්ජ නැතුව තාම මෙයාලා ට්‍රාන්ස්පෝර්ට් දෙනවනේ.
රසාක තාම හලෙන්නේ දින්නේ. ඒත් ඇයි දැන් බෝ ඔය ගැන අහන්නේ? නෑ අපි ෆිල්ම් එක බැලුවා. ඊට පස්සේ ඔය ගැන කතා කරන්න ගත්තා.
මං අර කිව්ව වැඩේ ගැන බලන්න පුළුවන් වුණාද?
Which one?
Hey!
සර්කස් කාරයෝ හෙට රාත්‍රී 8ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
Mysteries of the ocean floor. Sea of Sri Lanka. Coming soon.
TV1. TV for life.
Heavy rains bring floods to many areas. Landslide warnings are in effect for 10 districts. State sector employees on sick leave demanding 20,000 rupees salary increment from January. Postal workers on strike till midnight. Corrupt deals within the power sector reveals Anura. Kanchana challenges Anura to an open dialogue. Do not hand over valuable land in Trincomalee to India under the guise of developing it. Civil organizations raise objections. Search operations continue to locate 9 escapees of the Kandakadua Rehabilitation Centre. Harin dissolves Roshan's interim committee.
TV1. TV for life. The People's Platform.
We are in conversation with Professor Shamala Kumara from the University of Peradeniya. We're discussing violence, structural, institutional violence. Professor Shamala, let's talk a bit about the societal violence, the institutional violence. Poor rule of law, cultural norms that support violence, poverty, gender, social, economic inequalities, how the intersection of poverty, violence and trauma can be extremely detrimental to society, how institutions can undermine people's dignity. We know all the theory, but in practice, like how do we take this from the textbook into practice?
Yeah, I think the first thing is we need to talk about violence,
Right.
you know, and recognizing it as in all its forms,
Right.
and kind of the power dynamics that sort of set the stage for people to be treated a certain way.
Okay.
So, for instance, now some of our research looking at what happened with garment factory workers during the COVID period,
Okay.
right? All those things come up. People were found to be infected with COVID. But then you look back and you realize these people were engaged in work in not very safe environments. And then you look further and there's all this research talking about how workers have there was this culture where, you know, ill health was kind of tolerated. So it was within that context that, you know, COVID happened, and then people were expected to work, if you remember. And it was a time that we were all worried about. I think the economy kind of knew it was coming, this economic crisis. And at that point, it was okay for certain lapses even, and certain people not being so careful.
Right.
As a society, we were okay with that, right? And so we sort of were willing to discount putting certain people in the forefront and maybe experiencing some kind of ill health for the greater good of all of us. And those people that went to the forefront were people who are often not as powerful, right? And it's that same narrative plays out even today. So when you look at discussions about why we need labor reforms, it's again those who need the most protections from the state, who we need to champion decent work for, who are going to be affected by these reforms if they happen. Similarly, now they're talking about educational reforms, right? And there too, the kinds of reforms they're talking about are going to affect those who are currently suffering the most. And the justification for that is we can't afford anything else. So we are saying it's all right for a group of people who are currently really doing badly. We know there's food insecurity, there's a mental health,
Pandemic,
huge issue going on right now. All these like people without jobs, and it is that group that are affected by all these multiple crises who are again going to have to deal with the lack of access to education, the lack of access to decent work, the lack of social services like health and education. So how do we kind of talk about all these things in a more just way, in a more democratic way, that recognizes sort of, okay, not everyone has access to speak their truth. How do we make sure that we open up spaces for this. I'm not talking about the government or people who may have vested interests. I'm talking about the people. How do we as people go back? I mean, I'm saying go back because now when you look at some of them, I mean, when you look at the, say, for example, the Kannangara education reforms, you see a real commitment towards those who are most needing our help as a society, right? And now we have got to a point where we are okay with that.
Right.
How do we as a society say it's not okay if we have laws and the laws are going to affect those who are least powerful? We are not okay with that. We have to get a better system which protects those people. I mean, and for that I think we have to start with a conversation that we have not had for decades. You know, even after the war we did not talk about what happened. Then we had, you know, one thing after that, and we've never really quite processed it in an honest and frank way, right?
So Sri Lankans are a traumatized nation because we've gone through so many crises and we refuse to talk about them. We refuse to acknowledge, we refuse to cry, we refuse to grieve and figure out what are the root causes of our conflict, as a result of which we keep perpetuating, we keep repeating our sins. So in such a backdrop, what do we do? Because when we talk about being in a transitional justice-based society, but we're still unwilling to have the open, honest, difficult conversations. What do we do?
That's what I think we have to start with talking about it, right? And recognizing it. I know that sounds really very a small thing. But we are in a context where we are not even, as you said, talking about it. And places like your show, this is a great example of it, right? You start talking about this and talking about it in a broad sense, sort of not pinpointing one thing, but seeing it's, you know, all of it. I think that's important. And also we need to somehow advocate for institutional mechanisms that make sure that people can speak. Now, for example, at the university system, that's a great example. The simple act of putting a committee that is responsible for recognizing sexual harassment.
Right.
I mean, it has not solved a lot of problems. But what has done is that some complaints have gone all the way to some level and at least recognized. Now that itself is not enough, because after it is recognized we have to make sure something happens that protects victims, make sure our institutions change so that it doesn't happen again. All that needs to happen, but at least the very first step of recognizing it can happen if we create these okay, how can we create democratic structures that are not, for instance, completely controlled by people above, but the people above are accountable to these structures. If we can do that.
Shamala, finally, how do we as a society deal with our collective traumas? Where do we go to? Who do we speak to? What do we do?
I think we need to speak to ourselves, right? I think that's important. I mean, what I mean is, so I remember during this period, during the Aragalaya time, right, there were these people coming and they would come to these people's forums. They went on for some people's commissions, and they would talk about their problems. It was so nice because they come and say, okay, I have this problem and I've been going for years and years and years to solve this problem to this institution, that institution, this politician, that, and you can see that year after year it has not been resolved. Some of these problems are decades old, and then they come and talk to themselves, like, and then people will say, okay, so what can we all do to address this problem?
Right.
You know, So there was something very powerful to me in that whole experience. And I think we have to recognize that kind of, not the victim mentor. You go and you say, oh, woe is me, I have all these problems. Not like that. But look, I'm one of you, I have this problem. Hell, let's get together and solve this problem.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of, if we can create a system, I don't know how you do it, but
So the power of collective convergence.
Yeah, I
almost.
think that's really important. We have to get back to seeing its value.
Right.
And being confident that that can get us somewhere, rather than looking inward and trying to find what the problems are and how deficient we are, and you know what I'm saying, and solving the problems as maybe an individual or a family unit, seeing the problem in its more broader sense. I think that's what we have to do.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Shamala Kumara from the University of Peradeniya. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Veteran filmmaker Chandran Ratnam will join us tomorrow night. Good night.